Hello. In this tutorial, we're going to expand our game to handle the fact that the main player ship can collide with the enemy ship, and we're going to make sure that the game processes that and then enters into the dead state, so that we'll display a screen that says that you've died and you need to press a button to go back to the main menu. Okay, we're going to do that by processing an update playing right after we've handled the explosions and updated the missile count and so forth. But before we process any input from the user, we're going to check to see if the user has collided with the ship. So we're going to have a conditional expression here that says that if a collision has occurred, we need to process that appropriately. Now the best way to do that is to create a new function, and we're going to call that function shipEnemyCollision. And it's going to return to us a true or false value to see whether we have a collision between the ship and the enemy. So we'll call this shipEnemyCollision. And we're going to invoke that function here and see if it equals true. And if it does, that means we have a collision and we need to switch into the dead state. So let's go ahead and write that function now. It's going to be a private static Boolean because it's returning to us a Boolean, and we called it shipEnemyCollision. Okay. And then now we just need to do the logic to determine whether a collision has occurred. Now this is quite easy to do. We're going to iterate across all of our enemies. So for each enemy E in enemies collection, and I want to know, does the rectangular region of the enemy overlap the rectangular region of the player's ship? So let's look at the rectangle for the enemy, and we'll call that enemy extents, and that's just e.extents, right? Because we have that property within the enemy, and then we'll create a new rectangle, and I'll call it the player extents, and that will equal the ship.extents. Now notice that we don't have this yet, so we're going to have to add that. Just like we added it for the enemy and the missile, we're going to add an extents property that's going to tell us the rectangular region for that main player ship. So the easiest thing to do is to come in here into enemy, and we've got this rectangular extents, and we can copy that into the main ship. Because the main ship also has a sprite, I'll go ahead and paste that in. So I can ask it what's the sprite's width and the height and the XY position of that ship, that main player ship. So once we've added this property, extents, you'll notice that back in here, I can do ship.extents, and it appears just fine. Now I just need to do a comparison to see if these rectangles overlap. Now we have our overlaps function that takes in the two rectangles, so let's pass it the enemy extents, and we'll pass it the player extents. And if that overlaps returns to me true, I want to return true out of the shipEnemyCollision, meaning I'm going to look across each of the enemies and establish these rectangles, and if the overlaps function tells me that the enemy extents overlaps the player extents rectangle, then I definitely have a collision between a ship and an enemy. But if I get all the way to the bottom of this for each loop, and none of the enemy ships have collided with the player ship, I can return false, meaning there is not a collision between any of the enemies and the main player's ship. Okay, so back up here into our update playing, if there in fact was a collision between a player ship and the enemy ship, I want to switch and set the current state to be equal to game state dead, meaning the player has died by colliding with an enemy. And before I do that, I want to make sure that the menu display is going to show up properly. So I want to establish the menu display to be a new menu display, and that means that we're going to switch our scene manager to point to this menu, and we'll show the message that the player has in fact died. Now what's left for me to do is to handle the rendering of the dead state. So I'm going to scroll down here, and we've got our render, which is the switch statement between playing dead menu and paused, and we've handled the menu rendering, and we've handled the pause menu, and we've handled the render playing, but what's left now is to render dead. So I'm going to put a red background on this, right, because you've died, and I'm going to set the announcement right? We'll say menu display dot announcement is equal to you died. Press select to return to the main menu. Okay, so I'm going to set the announcement of the menu display to tell the person that they were playing and they died and they need to press the select button to return to the main menu. And then I'm going to tell the menu display to render itself. Okay, now we've got the collision working. So let's run this. And I'm in the main menu. So I'm going to press start to play. And I can shoot some enemies as they come along to me. And you'll notice that if I collide with any of them, then it's going to switch to the you died, and it's telling me to press the select to return to the main menu. So I can press the select button. That's going to take me back to the main menu, which is exactly what I want. And then if I press the start button, it's going to let me play. I can also pause the game, like we had already implemented, and I can, of course, press the triangle button to resume. So if I, again, collide with an enemy, you'll see that we died, and I would have to press the select button to return to the main menu. And then I would have to press the start button to go and play a new game. Okay, so it looks like everything's working out rather nicely for us here. So to review what we did, we're checking for a collision between the main player ship and all of the enemy ships. We're doing that in our handling the update playing. We're invoking a function called ship enemy collision that we wrote, and this function is going to return to us a Boolean value, either true or false, to tell us whether a collision occurs. We're going to iterate across all of the enemies and check to see if the enemy extents overlaps the player's extents rectangles, and if so, we do have a collision between the main player and the enemies and we'll return true. Otherwise, if none of the enemies are overlapping, we'll return false. And if there was a collision between the main player and an enemy, then I'm going to set the menu display to be active so that my scene manager is going to display that message to us, and I'll just update my current state to be the game state.dead. And that'll handle all of the enemy and main player collision interaction, and we've now implemented all of our different game states.